A quick introduction to PD sessions. They're a series of events designed to broaden conversations surrounding digital transformation and as a way for us all to learn from and with each other. And we invite friends of PD and guest speakers to share their thoughts on the things that matter and how we can make things better. In the Radical How, we set out how we believe government can be more responsive, using multidisciplinary teams, starting with citizen needs, and scaling iteratively by testing assumptions. And there are examples of those practices happening in local government already, but they're not embedded or widespread. The resonance of the Radical How with those working at place level is both natural and automatic. People working at place level are delivery focused, they're comfortable with complexity because it's unavoidable, and with having regular and short feedback loops between the decisions that they make and the impact that those decisions have. And that was the approach that we took at Hackney when I worked there before I worked at Public Digital. We had a relentless focus on users and on focusing delivery through multidisciplinary teams with internet-era skills on the problems that we needed to solve. And I think we were hugely successful in changing the culture at the council and delivering value to our citizens. But we also ran up against the same blockers as everyone else. So a technology and software market that's not fit for purpose in this millennium, and senior leaders who lack the digital skills and knowledge to effectively lead digital transformation in their services. And a preference for major programmes of change, so a boom and bust cycle of investment rather than investment in developing adaptive learning organisations. And in local government particularly, austerity has hit hard. The impact of the pandemic and the economic downturn means that services are stretched to their maximum. It's hard to recruit and retain skilled staff, demand for services is rising, and many councils are struggling to stay solvent. In this context, there's a need for a radical rethink about how we approach change. And that includes exploring how a future government might implement missions in practice in terms of a new what and a new how for public service design and delivery. And that's why I'm so pleased to be hosting this event tonight with such a great panel, launching the work that we're doing with Future Governance Forum and Camden. The shared convening power of Public Digital, Future Governance Forum and Camden means that we're well placed to start this conversation on behalf of local government and digital practitioners. So, no further ado, let me introduce the panel. So, we have Rachel Coldicutt, Executive Director of Careful Trouble, Dave Briggs, a digital practitioner who's currently working with several councils, also chair of Local Gov Digital, the practitioner network for digital doers in government. Owen Pritchard, head of cyber, digital and technology at the Local Government Association, and Hamida Ali, head of policy and programmes at the Future Governance Forum and former leader of Croydon Council. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Each of them is going to spend a few minutes talking about what they're currently working on so that we can hear their different viewpoints. And then we'll go into 3 questions that we'd like to explore tonight to help us explore some of the hypotheses that we want to test with the work that we're doing. Then I'll invite some questions from the audience and from our online audience via the chat, and my colleague Philippa will be theming questions from online and relaying them to us in the room. And finally, I'm going to round off by asking the panel a leading question. I'm a self-declared militant optimist. So what I want to know is, what makes you feel most optimistic about this work? So Rachel, can I start with you first?
Hello, everyone. So I'm a bit of an outlier here, because I don't actually work in local government, but I work around it, I suppose. And so what lots of our work does is think about what people do in the world and how people engage with tech and how it changes all of our lives. And we've got 3 different things we're working on at the moment that I think are relevant to this. But really, we were talking earlier, and I've been putting things on the internet since 1996, and it hasn't changed really materially. And the trends come, go, but actually the core things remain. But in terms of if there are 3 bits of work I want to talk about briefly, one of them is some of the things that wrap around government and really are about our experience in life in communities. So we work with a network of over 100 community organisations all over the country who are solving problems, whether they are running social co-ops or energy co-ops or the skate parks, right? It's really kind of hands-on in the community. And out of that work, one of the things we're seeing now, and I was in Liverpool a week and a half ago with the City Region Authority there, is that actually to deliver everything that is needed, we all need to do that together. That actually the ideas of what only government can do, what only business can do, what only communities can do, when there is no money, no time and urgency, how do we make things happen fast? And one of the things we've seen in that work looking over the country is that everywhere is different. And I know from a technology perspective, that's really annoying, right? What everyone here probably wants to do is make a thing once and make it work and give it to everyone, right? However, what we have is different assemblages of people and organisations and problems. And there are some people in different places who are better at different things, who've got more resource. How can they offer that elsewhere? What can actually the places that have less resource, how can they grow? What are the opportunities there? And I think it's really important to think not about tech as a means to an end. You know, it could be something here that helps and inspires change. Which leads me to something else we're working on, which is not very change-oriented, which is looking at procurement for AI in government. We're doing this piece of work with RAI UK. And one of the things we've found in this work that's really interesting, right, is that everybody who's involved in the procurement thinks they know if you changed it to be slightly more like this, it would work and it would all be fine, right? But that actually, at heart, maybe what the issue is that people are selling the wrong things, right? And that what you're mending through procurement could be the market, right? And could be the things that people are able to buy. And the irony of it is we're doing this piece of work from a law and governance perspective, but actually it's much more, I think, about opportunity than it is about the rules. And lastly, so the other thing that we do, and we do loads of things that when I talk about it, they don't really make sense, but it sort of does. So the third one is thinking about how AI can have better outcomes for everyone, and actually understanding from the perspective of the public and the many publics within the public what is needed there, which may be very different to what government needs, right? And I suppose, rather than talking about all the work, I'll just leave you with an observation about that, which is that when you're at the supply side, right, what you're looking at is efficiency, about making things work. When you're at the person side, right, you might have all sorts of things happening in your life, which of course everybody here knows. I know that everybody will have done lots of user research, but that actually all the complexity we're bundling up when we automate things to make them easier, like in the back office, we're not necessarily thinking about what is important to people at home. There's lots more I can talk about there, but I think maybe I might be the inadvertent champion for messiness this evening, partly because things are going to be messy anyway. And so how do we make that good messy rather than bad?
I really like that. What does good messy look like rather than bad messy? Dave.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Kate. And first thing I want to say is actually is how fantastic it is to have all this interest around local public services, which are so important, but also so sort of chronically misunderstood by so many people and taken for granted as well. I mean, my work sees me working with all sorts of different councils all across the country. Some of them are large, with thousands of employees and large sort of digital and IT teams. Other ones, some of our councils, they've got less than 200 people in the entire council, and they've got like their sort of digital team or their IT team is like 6 people, and they're running around fighting fires. So the experience across this sector is so different, and there's so little that we can sort of say is sort of the same and common experience and things like that. But I think that, across an awful lot of the work that I find myself doing is very much still fixing very, very similar problems over and over again in these different organisations. And I think Rachel's absolutely right to sort of point to the sort of a technocratic urge to centralise and harmonise and consolidate is not necessarily always the answer. But nonetheless, I think what we have to do personally is I think we need to get more sophisticated around how we look at that question, and we need to sort of break apart some of our services so that we can start to think about, well, what actually are some of the common patterns? What are some of the common sort of components and things that could be delivered in a more efficient way to a much, much higher standard, hopefully to a much, much lower cost, which would then enable us to protect those really, really vital frontline services, the human beings active in local areas, So rather than centralising, maybe we could make some of those people, whether they're working in social services, whether they're working sort of in housing and all of these kinds of things, where we can actually make that even more local and protect even more of that kind of stuff so that the messy stuff can be dealt with in the way that it needs to, but perhaps we can start to, I don't know, all use the same laptops from the same supplier, and stop having to renegotiate that 300 times or whatever it might be. And there's loads and loads of examples of this. Because the importance and the urgency of this debate is the fact that this sector is facing an existential crisis. And that existential crisis is that demand cannot currently be met, and budgets are reducing, and it simply cannot go on as it is. And I think that what we need to be able to have is a conversation which enables us absolutely to look at the potential for technology, for digital service design and all of this kind of stuff, but also some stuff around more sensible procurement and economies of scale and thinking about all these kinds of things. We can do all of that stuff, but it has to be done in line with a bigger conversation about how we want to deliver and support our local public services. Because the danger of just focusing in on the digital bit is that in effect we end up doing the wrong thing a bit righter than we did before. That we incrementally improve stuff and we don't take that big leap. So I think that for me, as a sort of a digital practitioner, as somebody that looks after quite a big network of people who are working in this stuff up and down the country, we desperately want to be part of conversations around how do we protect our local public services? How do we protect those people on the front line, working with incredibly vulnerable people, doing absolutely vital work? How can we do that in a way that sort of values the experience and the expertise of our digital practitioners, brings into play all of those brilliant sort of skills and knowledge and things that they have, but that's part of a wider conversation about how we redefine this sector to work in a much more sort of sustainable way. So I think that's the key thing for me. Digital is clearly a part of the answer, and we need to make sure it's a holistic discussion that acknowledges what bits can be consolidated and harmonised, and where actually do we really need to focus the localism aspect, where it can really make the impact that we want it to have. And I think that's me.
Thank you. And I really liked your point around really thinking about what really needs to be locally delivered, and can we actually do that more, not less? Owen, can I come to you?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. I'm very aware that not everyone is a local government native. So even though the thing I'm working on more than ever is how we collaborate as a sector, I think I just want to explain some of that. Thank you. I just want to explain some of that messiness and complication, really, and what that actually means in real life. As a sector, we employ about 1.4 million people. We have a revenue budget of about 121 billion, and we deliver over 800 services. Now, that's just in England alone. We hold data on just about every resident and exchange data and do services on behalf of every central government department. That in itself is extraordinary. Now, there are 317 councils, and about 150 of them are sometimes called lower tier, district and borough. They do sort of transactional stuff and the place-based stuff. They have budgets in the tens of millions, right? You then got about 20 county councils. They have the budget sometimes over $1 billion, but in the high hundreds of millions. They do more complex place-based services and also people-based services. And then you have the single tier ones, about 150 of them. They do it all, right? And that is vast. That is huge. And then when you combine that difference with differences in topography, in geography, and the demographic makeup of the places they serve, that's just incredible. Croydon would sound nothing like Copeland. There you are, there's alliteration. It would come somewhere this evening, right? But it wouldn't. But there is something more to it than this. All of them are trying, within the realm of what we're talking about this evening, trying to do three things, and that is to use digital technology to enable the place to be better, to have digitally enabled residents and have digitally enabled councils. And it's in those areas, when you unpick it, that the commonality will come. Now, that could be to do with connectivity, it could be to do with procurement, it could be to do with accessibility and inclusion, ethics, AI, service design, or whatever the case may be. But we've got to get better at realizing where that commonality is to enable better collaboration. Now, I mentioned 121 billion, and to give you a clue, 3 billion of it last year was spent on new procurement of digital services, ICT, BPO, right? That comes fifth behind the 30 billion on health, the 20 billion on buildings, the 8 billion on transport, and the 5 billion on waste and environmental services. So it's a big chunk of change, is 3 billion. Now, when you unpick that and look further into it, you're looking at 600 million on back offices, 500 million on support services, 400 million on networks, 300 million on ICT infrastructure, 50 million on consultants, and over 20 million on document management. Lots of this stuff is the same everywhere. These functions are largely the same in Birmingham as they are in Barnsley. I promise that's the last one, okay? Right? The commonality is not just about the procurement. Okay. Now, all of us are grappling with things like the digital switchover, connectivity in semi-rural and rural places, contract clauses between data providers and data controllers and data processors, so that we have better obligations after a cyber event. We need to get better at doing that stuff once and understanding and developing the policies. AI, we can do lots of this together. This isn't to curtail innovation, but it's to collaborate and do innovation better and to learn these things. So more than anything, what I'm working on and what I want to see better collaboration and us learning where to collaborate, where to cooperate, and where to use our collective force and will to get better deals and to do innovation better.
First of all, just to say, at the Future Governance Forum, we're a new, progressive, but non-partisan think tank, and we're really focused on the practical implementation of the how, as opposed to the sort of policy prescription of the what. And we're really excited to be working with Public Digital on this piece of work. And as Cate said, as a former councillor and the last Labour leader in Croydon, I'm very much kind of bringing that perspective to this conversation. And we've been saying from the beginning that this is not just about having digital practitioners talking to digital practitioners, but so I feel I'm very much representing that principle on this panel. But there are a few points that I wanted to make that hopefully kind of speak to this idea of the right kind of messiness that we've been having so far. And the first one for me is the relationship between central and local government and the balance between that relationship and the extent to which they work together. And as part of my preparation for tonight, I spoke to a few people, including Tim Spears. So many thanks to him for this conversation. And he was the digital lead at Oxfordshire until last week. And I was really struck by what he was saying about the work that the then Office for Deputy Prime Minister was convening and leading on the e-government programme, where they were bringing together councils that were facing some of the same challenges, getting them to work together, looking at kind of what was on the horizon, getting people to collaborate so that they weren't necessarily, hopefully, I mean, you know, let's hear if that really was the case or not, but sort of trying to use the talent in the sector for the benefit of the whole. And I just wonder whether it's that kind of collective problem solving that we need again, looking ahead at the digital challenges that every council will be facing, making the most of the talent in the sector, coordinating that resource, and that there's a role for central government in that, and to lead on what we would describe at Future Governance Forum perhaps as orchestration. And at the Future Governance Forum, we've been doing some work to really understand what mission-driven government might look like. And this idea of orchestration is one that we have thought a bit about. The idea that government can't achieve everything on its own, much as we've been saying, and its role can be to sort of galvanise the talent in the sector and sort of tilt it towards the digital ambitions that we might have and that we want to see. My second point was around the challenge of capacity, and Dave's already sort of spoken to this, but having led a council in the most acute levels of financial distress, I've really seen firsthand what that really means when a council is just thinking about survival. And more councils are now on the brink. But when you're in the sort of depth of that problem, I mean, just to give an example, we had so many investigations, reports that were generating hundreds of recommendations that all needed to be reviewed. And the collective responsibility for that sort of sat with quite a small executive team. So the capacity to sort of think beyond the immediate was really challenging and wasn't possible. So for me, I wonder how we recognise and respond to some of those pressures. How can we influence the kind of culture and behavioural change in that context for the sector at large? And then again, I guess thinking about a cultural shift. So when I think back to the discussions that I was engaged in, where we were trying to take tens of millions of pounds out of the council's budget, not dissimilar to other councils across the country, nothing was remotely easy, all Hobson's choices in front of you. But when we were looking at adult social care, for example, we were outliers in London. We were spending more than anyone else, but it wasn't resulting in commensurately good outcomes for residents. So it was right for the kind of transformation that we would be talking about in this space. But digital colleagues weren't a natural partner. They weren't in the rooms, for example, that I and my other cabinet colleagues were in. So again, is that a cultural shift that we need to make, where digital partners are part of the work to genuinely transform services? And does that pose a question around leadership, both political leadership and executive leadership, particularly those senior leaders for whom digital skills are sort of that's not their technical background? And my last point is really just to repeat the one on orchestration. All of that kind of resonates for me on these principles of orchestration that we've been centred on at the Future Governance Forum. And that feels that that's no less relevant at a place level, and I think raises some interesting questions about how central government and local government can work together for the benefits of the sector, as well as the sort of greater orchestration that might mean to follow on at local level, kind of across organisations that will be in any one place.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought up the leadership point, as well as I talked about that in my sort of opening things. I'd quite like to explore that as part of tonight's panel. So as part of the work that we're doing between the Future Governance Forum, Camden and Public Digital, we've got a set of emerging hypotheses that we want to test. And so tonight I'd like to focus on 3 of those. So I've got 3 questions for the panel, and I'll invite you to respond to them. Don't feel you have to respond to each of them, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm going to go to the audience for a Q&A. So the first hypothesis that's emerging is that to radically strengthen our capacity to intervene early and move upstream in public service delivery, which is essential for the economic and social health of the UK, local government really requires digital transformation. So I want to start from first principles. What's really at stake here? what could digital transformation really mean for people's outcomes? And what do we really mean by digital transformation? And Rachel, could I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. And so I find this interesting because this is something I've been, I've been doing what started being called digital transformation in the 2000s, quite a long time. And there's two interesting things, I think. So I think the first thing is it's quite easy on the one hand, I think it's maybe about technology, about the standards, about digitizing things. It's really about culture. And I think where we are now is there's a different cultural challenge to where there was 20 years ago, but the one we had 20 years ago remains. So one of the things about the word transformation is it's quite threatening, and there will always be people who don't want things to be different. And I think I would say culturally, we could all do a lot by working lightly, gently, not beating everybody up with the need to do it faster, better, that sort of thing. And the other aspect to that, which I think I've seen much more over the last 10 years, is there's always someone who thinks that technology will solve a problem that it probably won't. And I was saying just beforehand, we did a piece of work about a year and a half ago in a very different context for the Foreign Office, looking at what the role of emerging tech was at borders, right? And what the thing we saw is that very often there will be a wicked problem, a problem that can only be solved by policy change or something extraordinary happening in the world that people are working really hard on for years and years and years and years, and they get exhausted, and all the kind of verb goes out of it. And then someone turns up with, maybe these days it's an algorithm, maybe, a dongle or an app. Everyone loves an app still, right? And for a little bit, everyone gets excited again, right? There's money, there's opportunity, there's energy, and then it doesn't work. And now you've got a new thing that has to be managed as well. And so I think one of the things I would say is that as we're now, I think, going into the third decade of digital transformation and what that looks like, to do that sympathetically and non-heroically, I think is really important. And to be, I think it's really interesting to me that even though I don't work in local government, I know lots of people in this room, what that tells me is it's a tiny world, right? And that actually at the side of this room, there are many other perspectives and cultures and opinions, and they're important as well.
Yeah, Dave, do you want to come in?
Yeah, happy to. A brilliant insight there, I think, from Rachel's perspective on it. I think from my view, I think that, one of the problems that we have is that it's one of vocabulary, I think, which kind of points to the question, in that nobody really knows what digital really is, and nobody really knows what transformation is. And so we often find ourselves in these appalling situations whereby we're sat in meetings and everybody's using the same words, but you leave the meeting thinking, I don't think they were talking about the same thing that I was talking about. And yes, exactly, terrible business. So, and of course, and that's fine. I think one of the issues is, to put it fairly bluntly, is that a lot of what is called digital transformation in the local government sector is a long way from what probably other people would consider that. We're still in the business, I think, of putting online effectively very sort of old school processes, traditional processes and things like that. So we're sort of digitizing stuff rather than actually sort of transforming it. Not many councils at all, I think, have been able to get themselves into that space where they're able to think that now that not everyone, but the vast majority of people have access to the internet in their pockets most of the time. How does that change how we do everything? And of course, and the reasons why they're not doing that, I think, are perfectly understandable, which is when we think about some of those sort of digital internet age companies that do these kind of new operating models, whether it's the Airbnbs or the Ubers and all that kind of stuff, they are backed by billions of dollars of venture capital money. They've got no restrictions on how appalling their corporate cultures have to be. So they've got this freedom to experiment and to innovate and stuff like that. Whereas for councils, some of which, as we talked about, are incredibly small, that the problems that we're trying to tackle, just to name a couple, social care, housing, these are problems. We talk about wicked problems. These are decades in the making. And yet sometimes we're thinking that by whipping out a 3-year digital strategy, we're going to be able to solve it. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? But not only that, we're also expecting it to happen whilst the existing services are still being run as usual and all that. So of course it's not being, there's no transformation happening. And I think this points to what, we would have heard from Owen saying if he'd have been able to be heard, which was, No, exactly. It was wonderful. But anyway, but I think the point that Owen was making is that actually we can create that space to innovate and to truly transform if we club together, if we scale up, if we bring some of those resources together. That's the only way it can happen, because having 300 odd councils trying to do it on their own is always going to be slightly rubbish. And there's no way around that, I don't think.
It's interesting. I spend a lot of time working with clients and quite a few in local government, not really talking about technology or digital, but talking about people, culture and processes. And actually the join up between technology and digital enabling that change and that transformation to happen rather than seen as an extra thing or a separate digital strategy. Owen, you look like you're about to come in. I'll give you the mic.
I think I really agree with the idea of empathetic and incremental leadership. I think and appreciating that things are human activity systems, I think was once a reference that I got taught many years ago, and not just technology driven. Right? And I think that's an important point worth thinking about all the time. I'm not going to get stuck into what is digital transformation. I'm just going to speak to the idea of intervention. And I will say this on it, right, is that intervention normally comes with another word, which is targeted, right? And to do targeted intervention, you need to be able to change data into information, into intelligence. And to be able to do that, you need data standards and you need interoperability. And we're not there. So if you want to do what you've just said, that needs to be a priority.
Hamida, did you want to come in? Yep.
Just to perhaps comment on something that Dave said about, almost everyone has got access to the internet in their pocket, but there is still 7% of households who don't. And so I suppose that and that rises when you look at age group. I think it more than doubles to 18% for over 65. For DE socioeconomic groups, again, more than doubles to 18%. So I guess it just raises a question for me about what this conversation means for how we ensure that everybody is getting the best services that they can and responding to that need.
Yep. And do you think that's part of a broader conversation about social inclusion? It's not just about digital inclusion, it's about a wider conversation around including everyone in the services that local government's providing and designing those services so that they are inclusive?
Exactly. And I guess perhaps the opportunities that more and more new technologies offer is how you can free up the time. I think Dave or others, Dave might have made the point already, that how do you make more time for those conversations with people? So, I don't know, social workers being able to spend more time with families because actually the administrative burden of some of their work is actually taken by some technological opportunities. But just, it's important to remember, I think, that point and how we're making sure that people aren't forgotten. I feel like in my experience, a lot of the digitalization was about channel shift. It was about taking away telephone numbers and, narrowing the hours for a face-to-face conversation. So just making sure that we're making sure that the needs that people have are met, maybe in different ways, but that people aren't left behind in all of that.
Thank you. That's a
Could
really
I
good point.
just
Yes, of course.
come in on that? We have been doing a piece of work for the last 3 years in the South London with neighbourhoods to understand how being digitally included is a driver of health and well-being, and what it looks like when you're not. And I think the other thing that is really missed out is all the people who might have a phone, don't have any data, who are doing the things they need to do in McDonald's, hovering in the underground, that things that are meant to make life easier become much, much worse. And that actually, we've got another paper that my colleague Anna wrote that's coming out in a couple of weeks, looking at how young people are finding the services, which is completely different, right? So they're not Googling commands, they're asking for recommendations, talking to friends, and that actually we need to think of all those things together, not necessarily the digital transformation we've been doing for years and years and years.
Thank you. I'm going to come to our second hypothesis now, which is that public service delivery should be outcomes focused, comfortable with complexity, and operate on the basis of regular and short feedback loops so that we can test and iterate. The challenges to that approach in Whitehall around culture and values are very different to the challenges at a place level, which is potentially around capability and infrastructure. And Hamida, I was going to come to you first. So what do you understand the challenges to be to that at place level, and how do you think they differ from perhaps how they're better understood in central government?
So I guess I think my instinctive response is that while local government is better placed to be responsive to local communities, I wouldn't say that local government is always as responsive as it could be. So is it better than central government? Yes. Is it as responsive as we'd like to see it? I would say no. So just based on my own experience, I can think of plenty of community members that I've spoken to who think in Croydon that the council was not responsive, was not listening to them, was very difficult to do any business with. Community groups who were doing a favour for the council by we made them jump through ridiculous bureaucratic hoops over the most needless things. So, but equally, I can think of amazing examples of innovation, of council officers doing amazing work with community members that was at the other end of that spectrum. But then I can also think about some of our services and the challenges that we had in our housing service and how to provide a more responsive service to tenants, to paying customers in our community. So I think, while I think I probably have a perception, never having worked in central government, what that culture is like in terms of engagement, and I might think that that's better in local government, it's not where I think it should be. And one of my other conversations that I had with Neil Williams, who used to be the Chief Digital Officer at Croydon, is now an Executive Director at the BFI. Thank you, Neil, for the conversation. And he was talking about how one of the things that we reflect on at the Future Governance Forum when thinking about an incoming new progressive government is that they sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. They inherit a system that they have to make work better while building a whole new operating system at the same time. And sort of, I feel in line with that, Neil was reflecting on whether there are ways to, without disrupting the rest of everything else, are there opportunities within local government to build some new things that are sort of self-contained? His reflection was about the new towns policy, an opportunity there, but that was sort of the other thought that I wanted to bring into the conversation.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm always happy to jump in. But I think that there's a really interesting point there that is raised, which is, I sort of alluded to it very briefly earlier, which is just around, actually, do we need to have a conversation about localism? Of what local is, and perhaps even that word is as ill-defined sometimes as the words digital and transformation stuff. Just put it in this sense, I can talk about my local park and I can talk about my local airport. Now, those are two extremely different geographical kind of like boundaries that we're talking about. And a lot of the ways, Owen talked, about all the different sort of layers of governments local governance and things like that, whether it's, you know, single tiers and all these kind of things. These are all arbitrary lines that have been sort of just drawn at some point because it was politically or whatever convenient. And I think that there is nothing set in stone that says that those are the right sort of geographical areas by which we should be delivering certain services. And I just wonder whether perhaps one of the things that we now have available to us, thanks to, you know, being able to move data around easily between different parts of a system, you know, being able to for people to be able to work in much more sort of agile kind of ways, means that actually we can have a much more, what would be the word, sort of nuanced conversation about what local is. So actually, maybe we could start delivering certain services at like a neighbourhood level. You know, why does it have to be at a district or a county level? Maybe there are some things that are best delivered in a regional sense. Maybe there are some local services that could be done actually on a national basis, because that's absolutely fine. But, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to actually look at the problem we're trying to solve and then defining what localism means in terms of, you know, the best way to meet the needs of the people receiving that thing.
And as someone who lives on the border of 3 councils, it's really interesting to live in the borderlands between 3.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's that weird mismatch between NHS areas and things like that. You know, it's absolute madness.
I think I just want to speak to the framing of the question. I think we need to be careful how we frame things as local government versus central government, right? And it's an easy thing to fall into. And I don't think the idea of local government is this incredibly agile, responsive beast and central government is this monolithic dinosaur is fair. I think when you listen to, if you haven't done so, Louise Casey did a wonderful series on Radio 4 at the beginning of the year, and she talked about some of the tensions she had being delivery focused versus treasury. And I think the reality of things is often that we speak agile or we aspire to agile, but we live waterfall because we have to go in and pitch for money. And even though people talk about systems-based thinking and complexity, they will say, yeah, but tell me what it looks like in 10 months and show me your impact, right? And that's the problem. And that's the same problem in a council as it is for central government departments. And I think and I don't actually think that's unique to digital either. So I think there's just a mindset we need to change and realize that not everything is cute and linear and reductive, and some things will be base level assumptions and some things will be incremental change, and you're not going to find out if it worked for like a decade. And we got to be comfortable in that space.
So that's coming back to being comfortable with complexity. And I was just thinking about, write me a business case for transformation that tells me exactly what you're going to achieve in 3 years' time before you've started.
I spoke with a couple of people before this, and I think everyone wants systemic change, and when they want it now, you know, and everyone goes, well, actually, if you can point to the right direction and you can do incremental change and nudge things along, and aspire to great things, you're actually making progress. That's what progress often looks like. And if you see 1 or 2 systemic changes during your professional life that improve things on a order of magnitude, well, lucky you. And if you're part of them, brilliant, great, thank you. The rest.
So I would just like to go back to the question, but before that, just to pick up, my sort of new thing I'm obsessed with is what is like full the stack localism, right? Where like and how can we make the most of potential and opportunity where it is rather than waiting? So that's just a side thing. But to your point about the feedback, like so sometimes we work with like very big companies, and one of the things I find really interesting is that if you're in a logistics or a retail setting, right, what you would be doing is you'd be automating the easy things, right? You'd be automating the very automatable, if this, then that, one thing after another, and largely setting and forgetting, right? You know, the difference is you have the maintenance infrastructure is there to just keep it humming. And I think maintenance, like digital maintenance, is so hard to get paid for, so hard to resource. Just looking after a thing in a low drama way, and that actually it doesn't all have to be about the feedback and changing it, right? It can be just making it work, right? And that is often really, really hard, you know. And so I think there's this whole, like, I think everyone who has worked on a big complex result of this knows, like, you wake up dreaming of the ways it interrelates and the connections and things, but very often there are just individual bits of it that can be picked out, made to work, and then the important thing is looking after them, often for years and years and years. And so perhaps the problem, I think, that maybe everyone here has spoken about is money rather than tech. And what are the things that make people spend money? It's often new things rather than old ones.
So as we talked about at the beginning, didn't we? That, this preference for large programs of change with lots of investment rather than building adaptive organisations that change over time and respond to users' needs. That leads me really nicely into the final hypothesis I wanted to sort of discuss tonight, which is around common platforms, what common platforms might look like. But the hypothesis is that there is a tolerance for divergence that's necessary for devolution, but that common standards and shared infrastructure is absolutely necessary for efficiency and reducing confusion for users. And I think that bit's really important. So Dave, I'm going to come to you first. The question I've got is around what do you think common platforms might look like that give coherence for citizens? And what could the role be of intermediary institutions such as LOTI, and we've got some colleagues from LOTI in the room, the London Office of Technology and Innovation, on building capacity? And is there something around networks that nurture collaboration? So over to you.
Fab. I'll try and remember all of that question. Exactly. I'll do my best to cover most of it. I think there's a huge opportunity for better use of common capabilities, both in terms of tech and people as well, I suspect, across the sector. I think that what we're currently in a position is where we have 300 odd organisations that are doing, very, very similar things in broadly similar ways. There is always going to be that element of local policy setting and local policy making, which is incredibly important. But if I was to do my sort of technocratic reductionist thing, those are configuration items at the end of the day to a certain extent. I think that where we're at is increasingly a position whereby I think that it's almost like the luxury of each of these organisations doing their own thing. I just don't think we can afford that anymore, and we need to be in a position where we're starting to see where we can actually just come together and produce some new things. And that there is evidence for this working. So there's the local digital team at DLUC. They've been sort of funding projects and bits of work which are bringing councils together to try and solve common problems, and they produce some absolutely fantastic results out of that. And it shows that there are examples in pockets where this kind of collaborative activity can produce common shared platforms, capabilities, however we might want to describe them, that can be reused rather than having to reinvent wheels or, as is often the case, go to the same suppliers to spend more money on the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that case has actually been made in the last few years. What it needs to do is it needs to be scaled up. I think it needs to be sort of given some real authority in terms of being able to, encourage councils as much as possible to take part and make use of these things. But the final thing I think that I would say is just to reiterate that point. I think broad, it's a common theme across all of us, is that absolutely it's where we can share those common capabilities, those common patterns, we absolutely must do. But equally, we must always bear in mind that actually that there is complexity in this, and that must be reflected. So therefore, we can't look at an end-to-end an entire service and think we can just replicate that in every geographical area in the country. What we can do is look at that whole process, and we can say, well, actually, that bit's the same everywhere. That bit's the same everywhere. Let's do what we can to commonise that, create some commonality around those, and those bits that really benefit from, the localism, the having actually people there to go and talk to the vulnerable people, the people who can't access the internet, whatever it might be. That part of that, that beauty of localism is protected. But who cares where the laptops come from? Who cares who looks after the networks? This is madness. So let's identify those things where we can collaborate. Let's do an absolutely brilliant job on that. And then let's then free up councils to focus on what they should be doing, which is working closely with those most vulnerable people.
Thanks. I'll bring a couple of other panel members in if you want to respond to the 3 questions in one that I asked.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, rare as it is, I totally agree with what Dave's just said. I think it's going to be really hard to go through and turn that into a list where you say all these things are where you can be common, right? But the idea of collective procurement, collective innovation, whilst respecting independent innovation, but where independent innovation works, making it transferable and scalable is really important. The idea, and if we're going to do anything, it's about collaborating, collective power, and when it works, making it transferable and scalable. And where it doesn't work, having collective risk so that an individual council is not taking all those risks. We share some of those risks together.
I think I was just wanting to, I guess, ask a question really more than anything else, which was just, I think Rachel talked about this at the beginning about, I guess, the market and what that, lots of companies out there, individual councils may be doing their own procurement. Are there questions about the market? And if you don't have a lot of capability and a lot of resource within your council, are you at risk of buying something that's not what you thought you were going to buy? And the risk, it goes to your point, Owen, about how can we share some of that collective risk and support positive public procurement in a sector that's kind of changing, obviously, all the time?
I think that massively, if I can just jump in really quickly, that's a brilliant point actually Hamida's just made, because if we're honest, Owen went through the numbers about the sheer amount of cash that's being spent by this sector on technology. I think local government as a whole uses its collective bargaining power. It's absolutely rubbish at that. As all the suppliers tend to operate very much a divide and conquer kind of approach. And if we could coordinate that, if we could, negotiate as a block rather than just doing it individually, and stuff like that, huge amounts of opportunity could be done there. And I've just remembered another bit of one of your questions, which was basically, is Lottie any good? And yeah, they're all right.
So there you go, Eddie and Genta, you're all right.
Could I just
of course.
to say it all? I think it all comes back to where we began, because it's about culture and orchestrating, right? And the problem is that people need to want to work together and have incentives to do that, right? And that's the thing that needs to be designed. That's the policy work. I had a very robust discussion on the internet with someone who was saying the NHS app is infrastructure. It isn't infrastructure, it's an app, right? The infrastructure is the thing that makes the app possible, right? And sometimes I think if we think of infrastructure as people, we can maybe do more differently.
I just want to amplify that, because I think that's a hugely important point, is that creating space for collaboration and giving people the information and the information to know on what to collaborate and the means to collaborate is what's going to make this work, right? And you asked what I was working on. It's about making collaboration better. That is the core of this, not us sitting around deciding which bits should be automated or procured, but creating the space and enabling that. I think that's a great place to end.
Thank you. That's a really good place to go to the audience. So I'm going to take a couple of points, responses, questions from people in the room, and then I'm going to go to Philippa for a couple of questions from online, and then we'll come back to the panel. Is that okay? So, hold on a second. I am also going to organise some water.
Quick technical question, the mic on that one, so always speak at the time. You can relay the questions from the audience so people at home can hear.
Yes, I will do. Thank you. And some water. Perfect. So I can see that Theo, you've got your hand up. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of things to respond to, so I won't. I mean, I really welcome this conversation. It's so overdue and also timely. My question is sort of like beyond digital, because if we go back over the last sort of 10 years or so that we've variously been discussing these things, there is something that's happened locally. The arrival of, gigabit capable connectivity into people's homes and businesses and down streets, and what's the panel's reflection on, in a sense, how that elevates this argument or this discussion? Because it's not just digital, it's smart, it's sensors to detect damp and mold in people's homes so people can take action on that. It can identify localised flooding, use AI to predict where flooding is going to happen. All sorts of like interesting things that used to fill up my inbox as a local councillor. We see some of the same principles of good digital services apply there, but it seems to me that there's this whole other plane, which is a very rich data environment that we need to address. And to conclude, isn't this all about how we join up data a lot better, rather than the reworking, or in addition to reworking things we're going to.
Okay, so to just relay that so that people online can hear that, just going to summarise, what's the impact of better connectivity, better ability to use technology to sense things, to predict things, to give us more insight more quickly about what is happening to people? I think, is that a fair summary? What's the impact of that? And that comes back to your point, Owen, about right at the start, you talked about local government in its entirety holding data on pretty much everybody in the country, and lots of different types of data. So what's the role, thinking about data as well, because we've not really talked about data up until now. So that's hold that one in your heads. I have got, Paul, you're right in my outline at the front. Go for it.
That's great. So from what I look at public services at Applied AI, a company called Faculty, and spent many years as a public service reformer in the public sector. So my sort of pitch to you, Kate, is that there's another hypothesis, which is that there's a blocker that looms bigger than all the other blockers in this bit of the world, that I wish we'd focus some of our at the main beam of our attention to. And I say that I'm an optimist in this. I think people in this room create amazing things in local government services over the last 10 years, and countless thousands outside the room doing that and more. And I think there's a bit of, in the conversation, we'll all have a different view. I work in an AI company, I think this would be like, there's more opportunities in those sorts of spaces. But I think if you scroll down, I think we'd have a similar sort of view about deeply user-centered services, common infrastructure where that makes sense, commoditized things that are shared, deeply personalized and bespoke things to keep local character. But sometimes when you're doing reform, there's a blocker that's too big. And I think in this space, my experience is that the nature of the local government services software market, which is full stack, proprietary, data is blocked off from one place to another, services are curtailed from the ways that they can be reformed. And whilst there's 800 odd services, as Owen said, there's probably not a dozen that, like, most of the cash goes through that touch most people. And I think that we can't get to this place that's a lifetime's work. It's hard, it's cultural, it's processes, people, and technology, and all the rest of it. We're not going to get there until we focus our laser beam attention on removing, changing, reforming that barrier.
So there's something there. So just to play back again for the people online so they can hear, there's something around a blocker that's almost so big we're not talking about it, which is that the software market is broken in local government. And therefore, without fixing that, without shaping it, without doing something about that, we're not going to be able to achieve any of the things that we're talking about in the room. Is that a good playback, roughly?
It's a tough job you
I know. Believe me, I know. Philippa, can I come to you for questions from online, a couple of themes?
So, I just want to say, we've had a great chat online. It's been really rich, really nuanced. The party is definitely on the but there's 3 themes that have emerged from our Zoom party, which is this idea that Rachel touched on right at the start, messiness. And how can we help leaders and understanding who we mean when we say leaders? How can we help leaders to embrace the messiness, and how can we get digital leaders inside that? And that binary between a people focus versus a digital focus. And we felt online that was a bit of a false binary and we needed to overcome that. The second theme was around how do we get collaboration going, and is it about funding models that support collaboration versus funding models that feel competitive and that force councils to almost write user needs by funding criteria? Is there a role for mandating collaboration, or is that just an oxymoron? And then the final thing was about the how being broken and applying the right kind of solutions to the right kind of problems, but really thinking that bringing in those digital and design ways of working are almost need to be the vanguard before we talk about technology and moving towards technology being a heartbeat of an organisation's response and not its kind of slightly odd add-on.
Thank you. So I'm not going to recap what Philippa's just said because you could all hear that. Could the people online hear, do you think? No. Okay, so we've got a theme around, but they are online. So yeah, I think we're fine. Right. That is a very good point. But I'm just going to go back over. So from Theo, we had, how do we, what's our response to the increase in connectivity, the data, the potential of collecting data that predicts and analyses quicker than we've ever been able to do before so that we can respond, I assume is the outcome, we can respond better. The second is from Paul around the blocker in the room that we haven't talked about, which is that the software market is broken for local government. So how do we go around shaping that market? How do we fix it? What do we do? And is it going to prevent us from achieving what we want to achieve? And the third one around messiness of leaders. No, not messiness of leaders. That's really unfair. Messiness and how leaders can respond to messiness. Funding models that make you compete rather than collaborate. What do we do about those? And the how fundamentally being broken. Don't want you to respond to all of that. I want you to pick one that you'd like to respond to. Go for it.
I have 2, but I'm going to do the first one in one line, which is the software market is broken everywhere, right? It's not just broken in local government, so it's like if the software market wasn't broken, I wouldn't have a job, right? So it's like lots of the work that we do is about renewing that ability in communities and elsewhere. I really think that public service can and should be a driver for mending that, but it's not the only place it isn't working. I do a talk about let's make AI work for 8 billion people, not 8 billionaires, which is what's currently happening. But as a kind of side on to Theo's point, I think one of the things we just have to be really careful of, right? There's this like amazing Wizard of Oz thing, right, in which it all works and everything's lovely, and we have totally seamless end-to-end everything. And I think in that we've got people, and we've got people who have all kinds of reasons not to want that. There's a big issue around public desires and interests and the incentives, And I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is not what can the technology do, but what do people want? And can we make the things that people, the problem is you don't get emails from people who live in a neighbourhood to say, we've all got together and we've talked about it, and the thing that would really help us is such and such. You get an email from someone who says, I've got the smart bananas, right? And that actually what we need to do is give a voice to the people rather than only the market, because as I said, the market is broken.
I think I spoke to the importance of data standards and interoperability earlier when it was about interventions, so I'm not going to speak to that. And I think the issue of leadership blends into this question when I said don't frame it as central versus local. It's actually people who are comfortable with complexity and systems-based thinking versus people who are not. I think that's beyond the remit of digital people to teach people that. I think that's about every aspect of social policy and what we're trying to do. This idea of collaboration versus competition is about who's competing. And I'm fed up of councils competing with one another and places competing with one another. I want them to collaborate to make the suppliers compete harder. And then and if we can find a way to have different pilots for the same solution, competing with one another to be the pilot that we then transfer and scale. So we bring collective problems, we frame problems, we take them to the market, we say we're going to pilot 3 of them, knowing that 2 of them are going to fail, right? Or 2 of them won't be as successful as the 3rd, and then we look to transfer and scale the 3rd. I use that as an example. That kind of collective risk and where the competition is really important. And speaking to Paul's point and Rachel's point, the market is broken, and how we use the market is also broken, and the way that we try to apply the market to councils is also broken. All those 3 things need fixing, and how is bigger than just us, I think.
Thank you. On the data question that Theo raised, I completely agree. It feels like there's so much information that any local authority will have about its residents that it feels is sort of locked in different systems that don't talk to one another, and how you can take out that insight to really properly understand the needs of your citizens and respond better. I mean, to Theo's point about predictive technology and understanding what else is happening, I think that makes complete sense. I suppose my only question is, and I'm not advocating this position, but what happens when you can't respond to the level of demand that it kind of highlights? So I think about the extent to which you can respond to the amount of damp, the amount of mold. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not advocating for that position. But I suppose what I mean is it speaks to, I guess, the conversation we've been having about service improvement overall, what the digital element and how those new technologies are delivering, but that then pushes the service response as a whole to make sure that you can take advantage of that and make sure that people who are paying you as a landlord for the most vital service there is have a service that's worth paying for. I just wanted to make a small point about the conversation online about mandating collaboration, only because it speaks to some of the work we've been doing at the Future Governance Forum about understanding and exploring what mission-driven government might mean, and just the vital importance of collaboration. And we've made some recommendations for the sort of centre of government, what we've been describing as operationalising missions, about how you could sort of hardwire that in, certainly in terms of central government, and particularly potentially in some aspects of legislation. So I just wanted to touch on that.
I think there's a huge number, and in many ways, actually, quite a few of those different questions, they're kind of a bit sort of Venn diagrammy, and there's overlaps, isn't there, in a lot of those. I think to Paul's point, about the software market, absolutely right. It's a real dog's dinner. And to Rachel's point, I'm sure it's the same in other sectors as well, but we're kind of talking about local government, aren't we? So, let's focus in on that. And I've been sat in the chair in a council where we've been doing a procurement for a new housing system or for a new, regulatory services system, or good, this is what you do for a job when you're working in IT in local government, and it's just as grim as that sounds. And but you're sat there and you're faced with these choices, and and I was supposed to be one of the innovative people. But if somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, Dave, instead of buying one of these existing players, why don't we go and build our own one or something like that?" I'd be saying, "You mad? I want to keep my job, thank you very much." And almost kind of expecting single councils to be able to going out on a limb around this kind of stuff. It's never ever going to happen, is it? So therefore, that then feeds into the collaboration idea, doesn't it? We're talking about, and that notion of enforced collaboration. I'm not, I don't know whether we'd quite get away with that, but perhaps there needs to be something about, some of these areas where it makes so much sense to do it. That, there must be a way of creating the space, as kind of Owen sort of attested to enable that kind of stuff to happen. And again, and I think as Hamida alluded to, that the sort of the rubbishness of a lot of the software that we use in local government leads into issues around the way that we can use our data, and things like that. The two things are absolutely linked. Quite often the suppliers themselves can't explain how the data is actually stored within their own systems. They can't figure these tables out, let alone anybody else coming and doing it. Absolute madness, but there we are. That's the situation that we're in. So, that treasure trove of data, until the systems thing sorted out, as Paul points out, we're not ever going to be able to make the most of that. But nonetheless, the fact that, quite rightly, that technology is moving on, the connection speeds are getting quicker. This does open up huge amounts of opportunity, but it feels like it needs a coordinated push to be able to make all of that happen. And the last thing, you'll be glad to know, I'll say, is just about that question of the how. And I think that, a lot of us in this room and beyond it understand very well, the details of how best we do this stuff, as articulated in the radical how and other things about the positive benefits that user-centered service design can bring. The fact that we should be, developing new technology, new services broadly in sort of agile, iterative ways and all that kind of stuff. But, go and talk to the IT team at Skidmark District Council, right? It's not a real council. With their tiny, tiny team, and tell them that they should be running multidisciplinary, agile, user-centered product teams, and they'll punch you in the face, and then they'll go away and put out the fire in the server room that's currently, going on. Because that is the reality for so many people, and that needs to be thought about. Yes, that is the right how answer, but we've got to figure out how to enable this sector as a whole to actually do it.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to come back to you all in a moment and ask you my final question, which is, given everything you've just said, all of you, and it's been a really rich conversation in the room and online. Thank you for the party online. I've got FOMO now. What makes you feel most optimistic about this work and this conversation as practitioners in the industry, in the area? What makes you feel most optimistic? So whilst you think about that, I'm just going to pick out 4 things that have really struck me from this conversation. Again, chair's prerogative. My first one is something you said, Rachel, earlier around digital inclusion being a determinant of health and well-being, which I've never really thought about before. And I think that's really worth exploring. The second, Dave, is when you talked about needing to really think about what do we mean by localism now? What do we mean by localism when we have digital capability? What does localism really mean to us? Owen, you started by talking about we need to recognise where the commonality is as a starting point for the collaboration. And I thought that was a really good point, collaboration and innovation. And Hamida, you talked about the need for orchestration. And I think that's a really good verb and a really good way of describing how we might come together around solving these difficult problems and making the best use of digital technology to do that. So, Hamida, can I come to you first about what you feel most optimistic about?
So, both as being part of the Future Governance Forum and as a former councillor, I'm really passionate about local government. And I feel like it is too often the unseen, the unsung, the invisible glue that holds our communities and our neighbourhoods together, never gets really talked about unless it's in negative terms. And the opportunity for this to be the sort of focus of this piece of work feels important as well as positive. And I think about the community of all of you and everyone out there in local government and partners who support volunteers, community organisations. This is a really, really important conversation to support all of that work. So yeah, really excited about being part of it and working with Public Digital on it.
Thank you. I think I'll answer threefold, and I'll say first, the opportunity that technology brings, right? I think that's shared. Second, if there feels to be a moment now, right, that people think that certain changes can be made and there's enough momentum growing for certain changes. I'm not dreaming of systemic change. I'm just dreaming of a few more incremental changes, right? But with that idea of the people, I think the most important thing that gives me optimism is that tonight there's 100 people who are interested in this, right? In the room and online. And those 100 people are representative of 1.5 million who work in the sector who care about the common good. And that always gives me a source of optimism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was feeling really optimistic when I came in the room, and then Paul started talking, and then I started talking, and now, no. In all honesty, I think Owen's point is absolutely right. We're here, we're talking about it. People are taking interest in this stuff, which is absolutely brilliant. You know, Local Gov Digital, the network that, you know, I sort of helped to run, has got thousands of people that are signed up to it that are every single day, up and down the country, trying to make things a little bit better, you know, a little bit less rubbish than they were, you know, yesterday for the people in their local areas. And, you know, and that is such a wonderful thing. And most people, they're not doing it for the money, you know, they're doing it for the love and all of that kind of thing. And I think it is, how do we, as a country, kind of like maximise that capability? How do we bring the residents and the users of these services into that fold as well, to, like, you know, then further sort of amplify it and all of that kind of thing? How can we work more closely with, you know, like the third sector organisations, community organisations in local areas? You know, there's the potential sort of constituency here involved in this work is absolutely enormous. And all it needs is just a concerted effort to point everybody in roughly the same direction and get us all moving. And I think that's the thing that always brings me optimism, that, you know, we can do it.
The potential of a movement to actually make change happen.
So I suppose, you know, the thing I'm optimistic about is that it's like magic when it works, right? You know, that's the thing that keeps you coming back. And I suppose I'll close by taking my prerogative as someone who's not a civil servant to say I'm optimistic about the opportunity of the new government, which I might not be allowed to say, because even though they won't know how to do everything, it will be different, and like a moment of change is good, I think.
Thank you. Can I take a moment to thank our panel, who I think have worked very hard this evening. Thank you very much.